The wind howled through the trees, carrying with it the scent of pine and something else, something darker. The forest was alive with sounds, the whispers of leaves, the creaking of old branches, and the occasional snap of a twig underfoot. But there was another sound too, one that didn't belong, a low, mournful wail that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. In the distance, a campfire flickered weakly, its embers struggling to stay alight against the cold night air. Around the fire sat a group of friends, their faces lit by the dancing flames, their eyes wide with fear. They had come for a weekend of camping, a chance to escape the monotony of city life. But now they were trapped, surrounded by an endless sea of trees and the growing realization that they were not alone. And then, from the darkness, a voice, soft, almost a whisper, cut through the night. "Help me, please." It had all started as a simple idea, born out of a few too many beers and the promise of adventure. Mike, the ringleader of their group, had proposed the trip. "Let's go camping," he had said, his eyes gleaming with excitement. "We'll find a spot in the woods, far away from everything. Just us, the wilderness, and a few cold ones." The others had agreed, eager for a break from their 9-to-5 jobs and the suffocating routine of city life. There was Sarah, Mike's girlfriend, a thrill-seeker with a penchant for ghost stories. Tom, the quiet one who always seemed to go along with whatever the group decided. And Rachel, the skeptic who never believed in anything that couldn't be explained. They had packed their gear, loaded up Mike's old pickup truck, and hit the road, leaving behind the comfort of civilization. The drive had been long, the winding roads leading them deeper into the heart of the forest. By the time they arrived at their destination, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the ground. "This is it," Mike had announced, pulling the truck to a stop in a small clearing. "Our home for the weekend." The others had climbed out of the truck, stretching their legs and taking in their surroundings. The clearing was surrounded by tall trees, their branches swaying gently in the breeze. In the center of the clearing was a fire pit, the remnants of an old campfire still visible among the ashes. "This place gives me the creeps," Rachel had muttered, her arms crossed over her chest. "Are we sure we want to stay here?" "Oh, come on," Mike had replied with a grin. "Where's your sense of adventure? It's perfect. No cell service, no distractions. Just us and the great outdoors." Sarah had nodded in agreement, already pulling out the tent they would share. "Besides, what's the worst that could happen? We'll tell some ghost stories, roast marshmallows, and have a good time." Tom, as usual, had remained silent, but the slight smile on his face had suggested he was looking forward to the trip. Rachel had sighed, knowing she was outnumbered. "Fine," she had said, "but if we hear banjos, I'm out of here." They had laughed at that, the tension easing as they set up their campsite. The sun had dipped below the horizon by the time they were finished, leaving the sky awash in shades of pink and purple. The fire had been the next order of business, and soon they were seated around it, the flames crackling merrily as they passed around a bottle of whiskey. But as the night wore on and the conversation turned to tales of the supernatural, an unease began to settle over the group. The forest, which had seemed so peaceful in the daylight, now felt oppressive, the trees closing in on them like silent sentinels. And then there was the sound, that strange, mournful wail that seemed to echo through the woods. "What was that?" Sarah had asked, her voice trembling slightly. "Probably just the wind," Mike had replied, though his eyes darted nervously around the clearing. Rachel had frowned, her skepticism wavering. "That didn't sound like the wind to me." Tom had finally spoken up, his voice low. It sounded like someone crying. They had fallen silent then, each of them straining to listen. But the sound had faded, leaving only the crackling of the fire and the rustle of leaves in its wake. "Let's just get some sleep," Mike had said, trying to shake off the unease. "We've got a big day of hiking tomorrow." Reluctantly, They had agreed, retreating to their tents. But as they lay in the darkness, each of them was acutely aware of the oppressive silence that had fallen over the forest, and somewhere in the back of their minds a nagging fear took root, the fear that they were not as alone as they had thought. The first night in the woods was anything but restful. Sleep came in fits and starts, interrupted by the distant howls of wolves and the occasional snap of a branch outside the tents. Sarah had found herself tossing and turning, her thoughts racing as she replayed the events of the evening in her mind. That wail, she couldn't shake it. It had sounded so human, so filled with sorrow. She had always loved ghost stories, but there was a big difference between hearing them and experiencing something that felt like it had been plucked straight from one of those tales. Beside her, Mike snored softly, oblivious to her unease. She envied his ability to fall asleep so easily, but she couldn't bring herself to close her eyes, not with the memory of that sound still fresh in her mind. Eventually, exhaustion won out, and she drifted off into a restless sleep. Rachel had fared no better. Normally, she would have been the first to dismiss any talk of ghosts or spirits as nonsense, but something about the forest, the eerie quiet that had settled over it, made her doubt her usual skepticism. She kept telling herself that there was a logical explanation for everything, that the sound they had heard was just the wind or an animal. But no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them from the darkness beyond the firelight. Tom had slept fitfully as well, his dreams filled with shadowy figures and the sound of distant cries. He wasn't one to believe in ghosts, but the forest had a way of making a person doubt even the most rational of beliefs. He had woken several times during the night, his heart pounding in his chest, only to find the campsite quiet and still. But even in the silence, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were not alone. Morning came, but the sense of unease lingered. The group gathered around the fire, the remnants of last night's conversation hanging heavy in the air. They ate their breakfast in relative silence, each of them lost in their own thoughts. "Did anyone else hear something last night?" Sarah asked finally, breaking the tension. Mike shook his head. "I heard a few animals, but nothing out of the ordinary." "Why?" I don't know, it felt like there was something out there," she said, glancing around the clearing. Rachel nodded in agreement. "I felt it too. I don't usually believe in this sort of thing, but, I don't know, this place just feels wrong." Tom, who had been staring into the fire, finally spoke. "Maybe we're just letting our imaginations get the better of us. We're in the middle of the woods, miles away from civilization. It's natural to feel a little on edge." "Maybe," Sarah agreed, though she didn't sound convinced. Mike, ever the optimist, tried to lighten the mood. "Come on, you guys. We came out here to get away from everything, to enjoy the great outdoors. Let's not ruin it by scaring ourselves over nothing." The others nodded, though the unease remained. They packed up their gear and set off into the woods, following a trail that Mike had marked on the map. The forest was dense, the trees towering above them, their branches creating a canopy that blocked out much of the sunlight. It was beautiful in its own way, but there was an oppressive quality to it as well, a sense that the forest was watching them, waiting. They hiked for hours, the trail winding through the trees, occasionally opening up to reveal stunning vistas of the valley below. But even as they marveled at the beauty of their surroundings, that nagging sense of unease never truly left them. It was mid-afternoon when they reached a small, secluded lake, the water clear and still, reflecting the trees that surrounded it. They decided to stop and rest, taking off their packs and sitting by the water's edge. "This place is amazing," Mike said, taking in the view. "We should camp here tonight." Sarah hesitated. "Are you sure? I mean, it's beautiful, but it's also so isolated. What if something happens?" Mike shrugged. "Nothing's going to happen. We're in the middle of the woods, miles away from anyone. The only thing we have to worry about are bears, and we've got bear spray for that." Rachel, who had been quiet for most of the hike, finally spoke up. "I don't know, Mike. I just have a bad feeling about this place. Maybe we should head back to the clearing." But Mike was adamant. "We'll be fine. Besides, it's getting late. If we turn back now, we'll be hiking in the dark. Let's just set up camp here and enjoy the evening." Reluctantly, the others agreed. They set up their tents near the water's edge, the setting sun casting long shadows across the ground. As they worked, that strange, mournful wail echoed through the trees once more, sending a shiver down their spines. "What the hell is that?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. "It's just the wind," Mike said, though even he didn't sound convinced. But deep down, they all knew it wasn't the wind. The sound was too deliberate, too full of sorrow and pain to be anything natural. As the last light of day faded and the forest was swallowed by darkness, the group gathered around the fire, trying to ignore the growing sense of dread that had taken hold of them. But as the night wore on, it became clear that they were not alone in the woods, and whatever was out there had no intention of letting them leave. The fire crackled and popped, casting long, flickering shadows that danced across the campsite. The night was unnervingly quiet, the usual chorus of crickets and owls absent, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. The group sat around the fire, their faces tense, eyes darting into the darkness beyond the flickering flames. Sarah clutched a mug of coffee, her hands trembling slightly. "I can't shake the feeling that something's out there, watching us," she whispered. Mike tried to keep the mood light, though the fear in his eyes betrayed him. "It's just the forest playing tricks on us. We've been telling too many ghost stories." But his words rang hollow. They had all heard the sound, the eerie, mournful wail that echoed through the trees. It had been haunting them since the first night, growing louder and more frequent with each passing hour. And it wasn't just the sound. There was something else, a presence that lingered just beyond the reach of the firelight, something that none of them could see but all of them could feel. "I'm serious, Mike," Sarah insisted. "What if it's a ghost? What if this place is haunted?" Rachel, ever the skeptic, tried to dismiss the idea. "There's no such thing as ghosts. We're just letting our imaginations get the best of us." But even she couldn't deny the fear that gnawed at the edges of her mind. There was something wrong with this place, something that defied logic and reason. The longer they stayed, the more oppressive the atmosphere became, as if the forest itself was alive, its trees closing in on them, trapping them in a world of darkness and fear. Tom, who had been silent for most of the evening, finally spoke. "Maybe we should leave," he said quietly, his voice barely audible over the crackling of the fire. "Something doesn't feel right." Mike looked at him, surprised. "You too? Come on, Tom. We're in the middle of nowhere. There's nothing out here but us." But Tom shook his head. "I don't know, Mike. I just have a bad feeling about this place. Maybe it's nothing, but maybe it's not." The group fell silent, the weight of Tom's words hanging heavily in the air. They all knew he was right, that there was something wrong with the forest, something that defied explanation. But leaving now, in the dead of night, seemed even more terrifying than staying. The darkness was absolute, the forest a maze of twisted branches and unseen dangers. They were miles from civilization, with no clear path to safety. "We'll leave in the morning," Mike finally said, his voice firm. "We'll pack up and head back to the truck as soon as the sun comes up." The others nodded in agreement, though the decision did little to ease their fears. They stayed by the fire for as long as they could, trying to stave off the darkness and the unknown terrors that lurked within it. But eventually, exhaustion forced them to retreat to their tents, though none of them truly expected to sleep. The night dragged on, each minute feeling like an eternity. Sarah lay awake, staring up at the ceiling of the tent, her heart pounding in her chest. Every rustle of leaves, every creak of a branch sent her pulse racing, her mind conjuring images of ghostly apparitions and vengeful spirits. And then, just as she was beginning to drift off, she heard it again, the wail. But this time, it was closer, much closer. It sounded like it was coming from just outside the tent. Her breath caught in her throat, her body frozen with fear. She reached out, shaking Mike awake. "Mike, did you hear that?" He stirred, groggy and disoriented. "Hear what?" "That sound, it's right outside the tent." Mike sat up, straining to listen. But the night was silent once more, the wail gone as quickly as it had come. "I don't hear anything," he said, his voice hushed. Sarah shook her head. "I'm telling you, it was there. It was right outside." Mike frowned, reaching for the flashlight beside him. "I'll go check it out." "No," Sarah hissed, grabbing his arm. "Don't go out there." But Mike gently pried her hand away. "It's probably just an animal. I'll be right back." He unzipped the tent and stepped out into the darkness, the beam of his flashlight cutting through the night. Sarah watched him go, her heart in her throat, every muscle in her body tensed with fear. The moments stretched on, each one agonizingly long as she waited for him to return. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Mike reappeared at the entrance of the tent, his expression unreadable. "There's nothing out there," he said, though his voice lacked the confidence he had shown earlier. "Probably just the wind." But Sarah knew better. She had heard the wail, felt the presence just beyond the thin fabric of the tent, and deep down she knew that whatever it was still out there, watching, waiting. Morning came, but it brought little comfort. The forest was eerily quiet, the usual sounds of birds and animals absent, as if the entire world was holding its breath. The group packed up their gear in tense silence, the decision to leave weighing heavily on their minds. Rachel was the first to speak, her voice trembling. "We need to get out of here." Mike nodded, his usual bravado gone. "Let's head back to the truck." They set off down the trail, the oppressive silence pressing in on them from all sides. The trees, once majestic and beautiful, now seemed sinister, their twisted branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. The path that had seemed so clear the day before now felt like a labyrinth, each turn leading them deeper into the heart of the forest. As they walked, the feeling of being watched grew stronger, the presence that had haunted them in the night now palpable, a weight that pressed down on their shoulders, making it hard to breathe. The wail, though absent, echoed in their minds, a haunting reminder of the danger that lurked just beyond the edge of their vision. Tom was the first to notice something was wrong. "Wait," he said, stopping in his tracks. "This isn't the way we came." The others stopped, looking around in confusion. The trail, once so familiar, now seemed alien, the landmarks they had passed the day before gone, replaced by unfamiliar trees and rocks. "Are you sure?" Mike asked, his voice tinged with panic. Tom nodded, his eyes scanning the forest. "We should have reached the clearing by now, but we're still deep in the woods." Sarah's face paled as she realized the truth. "We're lost." Panic set in as the reality of their situation sunk in. They were miles from civilization, trapped in a forest that seemed to defy the laws of nature. The sun, now hidden behind a thick canopy of leaves, offered little in the way of guidance. Every direction looked the same, an endless expanse of trees and shadows. Mike tried to stay calm, though his voice betrayed his fear. "We just need to backtrack, find the last landmark we remember." But as they turned to retrace their steps, the trail seemed to shift and change, the path they had just walked now unrecognizable. The forest was a living, breathing entity, and it was toying with them, leading them deeper into its grasp. Rachel's breathing grew rapid, her eyes wide with fear. "We're never going to get out of here," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Don't say that," Mike snapped, though his own fear was evident. "We'll find a way out." But even as he said the words, he knew they were hollow. The forest had them now, and it wasn't going to let them go. Hours passed as they wandered through the forest, their desperation growing with each passing minute. The sun had long since disappeared behind a thick blanket of clouds, casting the woods into an eerie twilight. The silence was deafening, broken only by the sound of their own footsteps and the occasional rustle of leaves. It was Sarah who saw it first, a figure standing just off the trail, partially obscured by the trees. She froze, her breath catching in her throat as she stared at the apparition. It was a woman, dressed in a tattered white gown, her hair hanging in dark, wet strands over her face. "Do you see that?" Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. The others followed her gaze, their eyes widening as they too saw the figure. The woman stood motionless, her head bowed, her hands clasped in front of her. There was something deeply unsettling about her, something that made the hair on the back of their necks stand on end. Who is that?" Rachel stammered, her voice shaking. But no one had an answer. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound, but the air around her seemed to vibrate with an unnatural energy, a sense of wrongness that made their skin crawl. Mike, ever the skeptic, tried to rationalize what they were seeing. "It's probably just someone from a nearby town. Maybe she's lost, like us." But even as he said it, he knew it wasn't true. There was no town nearby, no roads, no signs of civilization for miles. And the woman, there was something about her that didn't belong, something that made it impossible to believe she was of this world. As they watched, the woman slowly lifted her head, revealing a face pale as death, her eyes hollow and lifeless. Her lips moved, though no sound came out, as if she were trying to speak, but the words were trapped in her throat. The group stood frozen, unable to move, unable to look away. And then, without warning, the woman let out a blood-curdling scream, a sound so filled with pain and terror that it seemed to pierce their very souls. The force of it knocked them to the ground, their ears ringing, their hearts pounding in their chests. When they looked up, the woman was gone, leaving only the echo of her scream hanging in the air. "What the hell was that?" Tom gasped, his voice shaking. That was a ghost," Sarah whispered, her eyes wide with fear. Mike shook his head, trying to deny what he had just seen. "No, it can't be. There has to be an explanation." But deep down, he knew the truth. The woman they had seen was no ordinary person, no lost hiker. She was a spirit, a tortured soul trapped in the forest, her pain and suffering so great that it had transcended death itself. "We need to get out of here," Rachel said, her voice trembling. "Now." But the forest had other plans. As they scrambled to their feet, the ground beneath them began to shake, the trees groaning and creaking as if they were alive. The path before them twisted and writhed, the once familiar trail now a maze of roots and vines that seemed to move of their own accord. Panic set in as they realized they were trapped, the forest closing in around them, the presence of the ghost now palpable, a cold, suffocating force that pressed down on them from all sides. And then, just when it seemed like all hope was lost, a voice, soft, almost a whisper, cut through the chaos. "Help me, please." It was the woman, her voice filled with despair, a plea that echoed in their minds, pulling them deeper into the forest. But this time, there was no turning back. The ghost had chosen them, and she would not rest until her torment was ended, one way or another. The forest seemed to grow darker with each passing minute, the trees closing in on them, their twisted branches blocking out what little light remained. The air was thick with the scent of decay, a sickly sweet smell that clung to their clothes and filled their lungs. The ghost's voice echoed in their minds, a constant, haunting whisper that gnawed at their sanity. "Help me, please." But how could they help her? They were lost, trapped in a forest that defied the laws of nature, haunted by a spirit that seemed to feed off their fear. And yet, there was a part of them, a small, irrational part, that felt compelled to obey her plea, to find a way to end her suffering. They walked in silence, the weight of their situation pressing down on them like a heavy shroud. The trail had long since disappeared, replaced by a tangled mess of roots and vines that seemed to shift and move of their own accord. Every step was a struggle, the ground uneven and treacherous, as if the forest itself was trying to swallow them whole. As they pushed forward, the whispers grew louder, more insistent. "Help me, please." It was Sarah who finally spoke, her voice trembling. "We have to do something. We can't just keep walking in circles." "But what?" Mike asked, his frustration evident. "We're lost. We have no idea where we are or how to get out of here." Tom, who had been silent for most of the journey, finally spoke. Maybe we need to help her." Rachel stared at him, her eyes wide with disbelief. "Are you serious? You want us to help a ghost?" Tom nodded, his expression grim. "What if that's the only way out? What if we're stuck here because she won't let us leave until we do what she asks?" The idea was absurd, and yet, in the twisted logic of the forest, it made a certain kind of sense. The ghost had chosen them, for whatever reason, and it seemed that the only way to escape was to find a way to end her torment. "But how do we do that?" Sarah asked, her voice filled with despair. "How do we help a ghost?" No one had an answer. They were grasping at straws, clinging to the hope that there was a way out of this nightmare. But deep down, they all knew the truth. The forest was a trap, and the ghost was the bait. As they continued to walk, the forest seemed to shift and change around them, the trees warping and twisting into grotesque shapes, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands. The ground beneath their feet was slick with mud, the air thick with the scent of rot and decay. And then, just when it seemed like they would be lost forever, they saw it, a cabin, hidden deep within the forest, its walls covered in ivy, its windows dark and foreboding. "Maybe we can find shelter there," Mike suggested, though his voice lacked its usual confidence. The others hesitated, unsure of whether the cabin was a refuge or another trap. But with nowhere else to go, they had little choice but to investigate. The cabin was old, its wooden walls warped and weathered by years of exposure to the elements. The door creaked ominously as they pushed it open, revealing a dark, musty interior. The air inside was thick with the scent of mildew, the floorboards creaking under their weight. "Hello," Mike called out, his voice echoing through the empty cabin. But there was no response, only the oppressive silence of the forest, pressing in on them from all sides. They explored the cabin cautiously, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. The interior was sparse, the furniture old and covered in dust. There was a sense of abandonment, as if the cabin had been untouched for years, maybe even decades. But there was something else too, something that made their skin crawl, a sense of dread that seemed to seep from the very walls, a feeling that they were not alone. In the center of the cabin, they found a small, tattered book, its pages yellowed with age. The cover was worn, the title barely legible, but the words, "The Curse of Blackwood Forest," sent a chill down their spines. Rachel picked up the book, her hands trembling as she flipped through the pages. It's a journal," she said, her voice barely a whisper. The others gathered around, their eyes scanning the pages, trying to make sense of the faded, scrawling handwriting. The journal told the story of a woman who had been wronged, betrayed by those she had trusted, left to die in the forest. The woman's spirit, consumed by rage and sorrow, had cursed the forest, vowing to torment anyone who dared to enter. Her ghost, trapped in the woods, was doomed to wander for all eternity, her soul unable to find peace. And now, it seemed, they had become the latest victims of her curse. "We need to leave," Sarah said, her voice trembling. "We need to get out of here now." But the forest had other plans. As they turned to leave, the door slammed shut, the windows rattling as a cold wind howled through the cabin. The air grew thick with the scent of decay, the walls closing in on them as the ghost's voice echoed through the room. "Help me, please." Panic set in as the cabin seemed to come alive, the walls groaning and creaking, the floorboards shifting beneath their feet. The ghost's presence was palpable, a cold, suffocating force that pressed down on them from all sides. "We need to find a way to end the curse," Tom said, his voice shaking. "There has to be something in the journal, something that can help us." Rachel flipped through the pages frantically, her hands trembling as she searched for any clue, any hint of how to break the curse. The handwriting was difficult to read, the words faded and smudged, but finally she found it, a passage that spoke of a ritual, a way to put the ghost's spirit to rest. "We have to perform the ritual," Rachel said, her voice trembling. "It says we need to find the place where she died, the place where her body was buried. But how do we find it?" Sarah asked, her voice filled with despair. "This forest is huge. We could search for days and never find it." Mike shook his head, his expression grim. "We don't have a choice. It's our only chance." They left the cabin, the forest around them dark and foreboding. The trees seemed to close in on them, the branches reaching out like skeletal fingers, the ground beneath their feet slick with mud and decay. The ghost's voice echoed in their minds, a constant, haunting whisper that gnawed at their sanity. "Help me, please." They followed the voice, the whispers growing louder and more insistent as they ventured deeper into the forest. The air grew colder, the darkness thicker, until they could barely see the path in front of them. And then, finally, they found it, a small clearing, hidden deep within the forest, the ground bare and lifeless, as if nothing could grow in the cursed soil. In the center of the clearing was a small, unmarked grave, the earth disturbed as if it had been recently dug. "This is it," Tom said, his voice barely a whisper. "This is where she's buried." They gathered around the grave, the weight of the moment pressing down on them. The ghost's voice was louder now, almost deafening, her presence so strong that it felt like she was standing right next to them. "We have to do the ritual," Rachel said, her voice wavering as she clutched the old, tattered journal to her chest. The ghost's presence was overwhelming now, her whispers filling their ears, drowning out all rational thought. The others nodded, fear evident in their eyes, but they knew they had no other choice. They had come too far, and the only way out was through the curse that held them captive in this haunted forest. Rachel began to read the ritual from the journal, her voice trembling but steady as she recited the ancient words. The language was foreign, the syllables harsh and guttural, but as she spoke, the air around them seemed to shift, the atmosphere growing heavier, more oppressive. The ghost's whispers grew louder, more frantic, as if she were fighting against the ritual, desperate to hold on to her torment. The ground beneath their feet trembled, the trees swaying as an unnatural wind swept through the clearing, carrying with it the scent of rot and decay. "Hold hands," Rachel instructed, her voice barely audible over the ghost's anguished cries. "We need to form a circle around the grave." They did as she said, their hands trembling as they joined together, forming a tight circle around the small, unmarked grave. The cold seeped into their bones, the ghost's presence pressing down on them like a weight, suffocating and relentless. As Rachel continued to chant the ritual, the earth beneath them began to stir, the soil shifting and churning as if something was trying to claw its way out. The ghost's screams echoed through the forest, a sound so filled with pain and despair that it made their hearts ache. "We have to finish this," Mike urged, his voice strained as he fought to keep his composure. "We can't stop now." Rachel nodded, her eyes fixed on the journal as she reached the final passage. "By the power of this sacred ground, by the spirit of the earth and the forces that bind us, I command thee to find peace. Let thy soul be released from this torment, and may thy curse be lifted from this land." As the final words left her lips, a blinding light erupted from the ground, enveloping the grave and the circle of friends in its brilliant glow. The light was pure, almost painful to look at, but within it they could see the ghost, the woman who had haunted them, her form shimmering, translucent, as if she were finally being set free. The ghost let out one final, piercing scream, a sound that seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the light faded, the forest falling silent and still. For a moment, they stood there in stunned silence, unable to comprehend what had just happened. The oppressive weight that had hung over them for so long was gone, replaced by a profound sense of calm. Is it over?" Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. "I think it is," Tom replied, his voice filled with a mix of relief and exhaustion. "I think we did it." They released their hands, the tension that had gripped them finally easing as they stepped back from the grave. The ground was still, the air around them warm and gentle, as if the forest itself had been released from the curse that had held it in its dark embrace. "We should go," Mike said, his voice filled with determination. "We need to get out of here while we can." The others nodded in agreement, their thoughts turning to escape, to finally leaving this nightmare behind them. They retraced their steps through the forest, the path now clear and unchanging, as if the woods themselves were guiding them home. As they walked, they couldn't help but glance back, half expecting to see the ghost following them, her sorrowful eyes pleading for more. But there was nothing, only the trees, standing tall and silent, as if watching them go. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, they emerged from the forest, the sight of their campsite filling them with an overwhelming sense of relief. The sun was beginning to rise, its golden rays filtering through the trees, casting the clearing in a warm, gentle light. "We made it," Rachel said, her voice filled with disbelief. "We're out." They collapsed onto the ground, the exhaustion of the night finally catching up with them. The terror, the fear, the constant dread, it was all gone, replaced by a deep, bone-deep weariness. But they were alive. They had survived. As they sat there, catching their breath, Sarah spoke up, her voice quiet but steady. "What do we do now?" "We leave," Mike replied firmly. "We pack up and get as far away from this place as possible." The others nodded in agreement. There was no question of staying any longer, not after everything they had been through. They quickly packed up their belongings, their movements hurried and tense as they worked in silence. The events of the night hung heavy in the air, the weight of what they had experienced something they could barely begin to process. But as they prepared to leave, Rachel paused, her gaze lingering on the edge of the forest. There was something about the trees, something different. The darkness that had once seemed so impenetrable, so menacing, was gone, replaced by a sense of peace, of stillness. "It's over," she whispered to herself, as much to convince herself as to anyone else. "It's really over." With one last look at the forest, they turned and left, the rising sun at their backs, the nightmare of the night fading into memory. Weeks passed, and the events of that night in the forest began to feel like a distant dream, a nightmare that was fading with each passing day. But for the group of friends who had lived through it, the memories remained vivid, etched into their minds like a scar. They didn't talk about it much, each of them dealing with their trauma in their own way. There were nightmares, of course, visions of the ghost, of the forest, of the curse that had nearly claimed their lives. But there was also a sense of closure, of peace, knowing that they had done what they could to help the tortured soul find rest. Rachel kept the journal, the only tangible reminder of what they had been through. She often found herself reading through it, tracing the faded, spidery handwriting with her fingers, as if trying to make sense of the curse that had so nearly destroyed them. But there were no answers, only the haunting words of a woman long dead, her suffering now finally put to rest. Life moved on, as it always does, and slowly, the group of friends began to find a new sense of normalcy. They returned to their daily routines, their lives picking up where they had left off before the nightmare began. But the experience had changed them, in ways they were only just beginning to understand. There was a new closeness between them, a bond forged in the fires of fear and terror, a connection that went beyond mere friendship. They had faced something dark, something evil, and they had survived. And that, more than anything, was what they held on to. As for the forest, it remained as it always had, silent, mysterious, and dark. But the curse that had once hung over it like a shadow was gone, the spirit that had haunted its depths finally at peace. And though they would never forget the horrors they had faced, they knew that they had done something good, something right. They had helped a lost soul find rest, and in doing so, had freed themselves from the nightmare that had nearly claimed them. But sometimes, late at night, when the world was quiet and the darkness seemed to press in from all sides, they could still hear it, the faintest whisper carried on the wind. "Thank you. Thank you." And they would smile, knowing that somewhere, in the depths of that dark, haunted forest, a soul was finally at peace.